Magandang araw. Ito ang programang The NCCA Hour. Sa loob po ng isang oras, inyong matutunghayan ang programang mag-aangat na inyong kaalaman sa ating sining at kultura na pinamagatang Days of the Crimson Sun, The Retelling of the Battle of Manila. Ang programang ito ay inihahandog ng Pambansang Komisyon ng Kultura at Sining na pinamumunuan ni Professor Felipe de Leon bilang chairman at ni Ginang Emerita V. Almosara bilang executive director sa pakikipag-ugnayan sa Federation of International Cable TV Association of the Philippines na pinamumunuan ni Ginang Estrelita J. Tamano at ng istasyong ito. Ang programang ito ay may 10 episodes na naglalahad ng ating mayamang kasaysayan, kultura at sining na isinasahimpapawid araw-araw sa lahat ng cable TV station sa buong bansa. Ako po si Chat Ansagay, ang inyong host. Kabisera ang Manila sa kalakalan, kultura at sining, edukasyon at iba pa. Dumanas ito ng maraming paghihirap sa mga dayuhan na ginawa ng maraming kwento upang maintindihan natin ang mga nangyari noong panahon na yon at kung paano natin itinaglaban ang ating bayan at ang kadakilaan ng ating mga kababayan.
On the 3rd day of February 1945, the sun set in Manila, ominously redder than ever, like an unusually large crimson ball. In the diaries that recorded the event, it was written,
"Red. The sun was red.
The sky dazzled our eyes with the color of a master's brush.
A mass of red. The end of splendid day."
3 years had passed since General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return. By January the 9th, 1945, the general and his troops had landed full scale in Lingayen, making their way to Manila, just 110 miles away. The war with Japan had indeed brought indescribable destruction and oppression, and with it the Filipinos' hatred towards the enemy. But even long before the battles were fought, already suspicions of Japan gripped Filipinos early in the century, although a few favored the conquest by the Japanese. It was also suspected that Japanese selling ice cream cones were in fact officers of the Imperial Army. This play, written in 1906 by Severino Reyes, underscores that fear echoed by the majority when rumors of the Philippines' sale to Japan wildly circulated.
Dito. Oh, Diyos ko! Yay! Siguro dito, eh? Hindi pwede yan. Alam ko na kung saan. Alam ko na, wala na ikay dito na hila na.
Hola! Compadre!
Compadre, hola! Hola! Hola, compadre!
Ang mga bata, ano, comadre?
Nandito sila, nandito. Ponying, Conchita. Nandito na si compadre ang Caliciano.
Ponying, ang biyanan mo.
Huwag kang bastos. Magandang araw po, Don Feliciano. Hola, joven! Ano ba po niyo? Conchita.
Compadre, bakit nakasuot ka na ng suot ng Hapones? Padre.
Oo, pagkat ako'y Hapones. Todos Hapones. Oo, Hapones. Legítimo, e verdadero, niyo ko ama.
Chico, sila ang biyanan mo sa konfis na kaibigan.
Conchita, huwag kang maingay, por Diyos.
Mas mabuti ang masira ang ulo niya. Pagdakay, magpamana ka!
Na ito! Pakinggan ninyo yung babasahin ko. Ito'y telegrama buhat sa San Francisco.
Buhat sa San Francisco?
Si.
Sa konvento ba galing sa loob ng Maynila?
Huwag ka nang magsalita, Sansa.
Con insistencia circula el rumor que el Japón está haciendo negociaciones para comprar las Islas Filipinas.
Siguro.
Sa makatwid, mapapasapon tayo. Kaya laging tuwa ko.
Hindi ako makakapaniwala sa balita na yan ay isang malaking kabulaanan. Ka na.
Ipagbibili po tayo ng parang lilitsunin? No puede ser. Yo protesto con todo de energía mi alma.
Ari rin ba tatang may pagbili isang bayan tulad ng isang kalakal?
Kaya nga hindi ako makapaniwala sa balitang yan, anak ko.
Kaawa-awang bayan ni Rizal. Ang pinagugugulan ng kanyang buhay, ipagpapalit sa apa.
The staging of the play came just 7 years after the Philippines was sold by Spain to the United States for only $20 million. To be sold again, and this time to a nation known for martyring and persecuting Christians in earlier centuries, was not the most pleasing of prospects to the only Christian nation in Asia, the Philippines. 333 years of Christianization and 4 decades of Americanization had already shaped Filipino attitudes. To them, other Oriental cultures and ideas became exotic. At the turn of the century, Japan to the Filipino represented a culture too alien for comfort. To be conquered by them was a source of foreboding. And with Japan's active military campaign in Northeast Asia, there were stories of Nanking and Manchuria. The images were reason enough to fear Japan. By February 3, 1945, the foreboding turned prophetic. When the sun set, crimson as ever on the eve of liberation, some citizens of Manila read it as a premonition of the destruction that would come upon their city and themselves. With the fires of destruction raging and the streets red from bloodshed, the sun would reflect the agony of a city, and for 29 days would set as days of the crimson sun. Since the Japanese Imperial Army marched into Manila on January the 2nd, 1942, the population lived in constant fear of the uncertain. The Japanese soldiers, it was observed, were given to capricious and oftentimes arrogant behavior. The slightest infraction could result in punishment and even death. The anticipated horror was at hand.
As I passed the Rizal Stadium, almost corner of La Garisa, I was stopped by some Japanese soldiers with bayonets, and they led me with other people that were walking, others in bicycle, and they led us to a place where 3 Filipinos were being tortured.
I was burned, my face, my arms, my knee, my legs, and then I got shrapnel later on. I didn't get it there yet.
Everybody fell. And they started with their bayonets, with their poles. There was a lot of wailing and crying, shrieking, shouting.
We were told to leave because they were going to blast the buildings. And all throughout we could hear tanks, machine guns, we could see fires. It was very, very frightening and very eerie.
This was a different breed of conqueror who stripped the Filipino of his sense of dignity by imposing their own culture through violent and forceful means. a method that did not sit well with a people whose concept of nationhood had been crystallized 50 years before the Japanese troops even landed in the Philippines.
Once the Japanese occupied us, then they started mistreating the population. For example, and I think one of the worst things they did, you had to bow before a sentry when you passed him. And if you did not bow, you were slapped. You know, Filipino can take a lot of hardship and a lot of deprivation, but he will not take an insult. And that was an insult.
Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, even that was under the British, they surrendered quickly. And they could not understand why we had this fanatic love for Americans, and why we fought in the guerrillas, and why we detested them. They had a way of telling, putting their arms beside us and saying, "Look, we are the same color. Why do you prefer these white men to us?"
I think they were pretty disgusted with the fact that we had embraced Western ideas, Spanish cultural influence, and American ideas. I think they were quite disgusted with that, because they wanted to, they thought European civilization was decadent, it was not fit for Asia, it simply took advantage of the Asians, so they wanted to change all that.
In the end, the fact that we hated them was what enraged them, and what made the massacre of Manila, what gave the brutality.
As American troops closed in on Manila in January 1945, Japanese troop behavior became increasingly arbitrary. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, head of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines, reportedly had difficulty in controlling his troops.
Yamashita was in command of what was called then the 14th Area Army, which was comprised of land troops. But separate from him and not under him were the naval troops and the Air Force, the Army Air Force. These were two other separate commands which were not directly under his authority. The situation at that time was such that the Navy was a completely separate organization which disliked being under the Army. The rivalry was so strong that they even manufactured weapons that could not be used by the other side. They manufactured screws for Army machine guns which could not be used in Navy machine guns. It was that bad. And so therefore it's a strange situation. You have a Japanese military but splintered into three groups.
The result in this break in the chain of command gave rise to scandalous troop behavior which was already noted even in China. The infamous Rape of Nanking in 1937 was an example of this, where acts previously scorned upon by military codes were now left unpunished, ignored, and denied. The time-honored creed of the samurai known as Bushido, which professed self-denial and total commitment to a cause, even unto death, assumed distortions inclined to suit Japan's new militaristic ideologies.
The Japanese army was strange in the sense that it borrowed the techniques, it borrowed the structure from Germany, from Prussia, from France. It borrowed the Western organization, and yet the samurai spirit was still there, the Japanese spirit was still there. And within this was the idea that if you perceive certain things that your seniors do not perceive, then you can act. In fact, they have a whole word for this. They call it Gekkokujo. It means rebellion or insubordination.
When General Yamashita was accorded his new position as head of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines in October 1944, he found the civilian population completely antagonized by previous Japanese conduct. This resentment was embodied in the 180,000 volunteers who had, over the war years, joined the resistance. Foreign communities residing in the Philippines, like the Chinese, formed their own resistance groups. Even they were not spared the consequences of Japanese invasion.
Yun, to oras dating sila, kami organize agad isang malaki-laki lang refugee center dito sa Sanchez Extension. Ang iyong representative natangkap kami, almost 800. Pati bata, pati matanda, pati Pilipino, insik, walang pili, basta walang makain.
In 1944, the situation in the Philippines had come, as General Yamashita said, as one of kill or be killed. The inhuman aspects of war accelerated even more in those 29 desperate days of Manila's occupation. Given the impending dimensions of defeat, General Yamashita saw the futility of defending Manila. In late January 1945, he started evacuating his troops out of the city, heading north into the mountains, where he established his final headquarters. Unlike MacArthur in 1941, Yamashita did not formally declare Manila an open city. Manila was defended. Japanese naval units still stationed in Manila under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi of the 31st Naval Special Force decided to fortify Manila and staged a fierce battle to the death.
It was partly their own ethos of fighting to the end. The Japanese did not retreat. They fought and died in their place. And, you know, from the point of view of a fighting man, that is admirable. If you do it among fighting men. But when you take civilians and you target them and oppress them and rape them, well, that is something else again. That is the ethos gone completely haywire. They could even have said, well, we will defend certain parts of the city, let the civilians get out. But they did not do that. In fact, they targeted the civilians for killing and raping. So, now, when they did that, of course, a lot of the cultural stock of the country was destroyed.
To this day, the seemingly conflicting Japanese troop movements can only be speculated upon. If the orders on the fate of Manila were unclear, a Japanese battalion order, however, succinctly outlines the manner on how to deal with its civilians. When Filipinos are to be killed, they must be gathered in one place and disposed of with the consideration that ammunition and manpower must not be used to excess, because the disposal of dead bodies is a troublesome task. They should be gathered into houses which are scheduled to be burned or demolished. They should also be thrown into the river.
But it is in Manchuria and China where they perfected a lot of the techniques that they used in the Philippines. Many of the soldiers who were sent here, at least the officers, had experience in China.
The American troops were caught unprepared for the fierce defense of Manila. To General Douglas MacArthur, the retaking of Manila became an obsession. Despite his repeated appeals for surrender, the embattled Japanese army put up a defense even more savagely. On the eve of February the 3rd, 1945, the elements of an apocalypse were in place. A cornered and defeated army amidst hostile but unarmed civilians. A counter-force who saw the strategy of destructiveness as the most effective and efficient way to flush out the enemy. And a population thrice conquered, wholly committed to their Western allies who promised not only liberation, but independence. And independence that would be paid for dearly. The cost, the annihilation of the city and widespread killing of its citizenry. For Filipinos, it is the toll exacted by history that makes this period so difficult to remember.
Magbabalik po ang programa pagkatapos ng maikling patalastas.